I would now like to introduce today's presenters. Arko Bazak, partner, is a leader in the business process services team and assists clients on topics related to the entire HR and talent services value chain, including permanent and contingent talent acquisition, payroll, benefits, learning, broader talent management, and multi-process HR outsourcing. Priyanka Mitra is a practice director in the business process services team and manages Everest Group's HR outsourcing offering. She has authored numerous industry reports on the HR services and technology market and drives through leadership pieces across these areas for the firm. Varun Malik is a practice director at Everest Group's business process services team. He assists clients on topics related to value creating through inorganic and organic routes throughout talent acquisition landscape. And with that, I would like to turn things over to Arko.
Thank you, Rafael. So today we'll discuss about the contingent staffing industry, right? So, throughout the last many years or decades, contingent workforce, or specifically staff augmentation or contingent staffing, has been a key part of the overall talent strategy for various organizations. And the contingent staffing providers have been a key set of players in this industry. But today we see a lot of interesting challenges that are being faced by this industry, and we'll talk about some of those challenges. Post that, we'll discuss on how can some of those challenges be solved, and we'll specifically talk about the pivot towards managed services from a staff augmentation model. And lastly, we'll speak about how to navigate that transaction or how to navigate that transition to a managed services model. And this is the section where we'll spend the most amount of time today, right? This is the most challenging and interesting question for today. And that is where we want to really focus on. And of course, we'll have the Q&A towards the end. So let's start off with, what are the challenges that we see in the industry today, right? None of this should be a surprise for anyone over here, but the talent demand supply gap has been really crazy for the last few months. And if I look at the US data in sort of Q1 of this year, there were more than 6 million job openings than unemployed, right? So that's a really bad situation. And that very understandably had a follow-on impact on the rising attrition. We have talked about the great resignation, and at the same time, pay rates or wage rates or salaries have been increasing. And, consequently, we did a survey with a large number of enterprises across the globe. And one key thing that came out very strongly is contingent labor or staff augmentation is something that organizations are intending to use a lot in the future. So almost 3/4 of the organizations do expect to use more contingent labor or staff augmentation. And very interestingly, HR leaders also anticipate an increased role in this space or in the contingent workforce management in the next 12 to 18 months, right? So Priyanka, looking at all of this, do you see this as an opportunity for staffing providers?
Well, Orko, absolutely. As you said, even HR leaders are looking at contingent talent. And as you know, HR leaders typically have shied away from the contingent landscape. To put it in perspective, last year was definitely an anomaly in terms of many events that happened. We are still recovering from COVID. We saw great resignation, as Orko mentioned. We see, high rates of employment and, more and more attrition. So that kind of opened up the market for staffing vendors. More and more enterprises today are reliant and want to rely on contingent talent, and hence are looking towards contingent staffing providers to bridge the gap. But you have to understand that last year was, once in a lifetime event. It was a blue moon event. The staffing industry inherently has some challenges. Last year was a good year for them. They saw a lot of growth. But the industry itself is plagued with some inherent challenges, because the way in which the industry operates, the staffing industry operates. There are many problems that they may face when they are looking to basically get that opportunity. So if I were to put it in simple terms, it's a thorny road for many of the staffing providers when they want to go and grab that opportunity. And these are because of multiple things. Few of them are inherent to the market. Some of them are because of the evolving talent landscape and hence they need to pivot their offerings. And this is, and given it's full of opportunities, there is more and more competition as well. The next couple of slides, we will touch upon how these themes, unless combated, can combine to create a thorny road for staffing providers. So the first up the list is the advent of alternate sourcing channels. Now, if you look at historically, sorry, if you can move to the next slide. If you look at it historically, historically contingent workforce may have been used by enterprises either to fill, low skilled roles, or they were like a cost effective stopgap solution for some of the permanent talent. But today that has changed. Today we see contingent staffing being used across the board, right? Across all roles, even strategic important ones. However, we have also seen, enterprises also open up to more and more contingent talent. Now, as enterprises look towards temporary talent as a strategic resource for the talent challenges, they will also look to diversify in which, diversify channels through which they can get access to temporary talent. What we have seen is that we have seen the emergence of different kinds of sourcing channels. Everybody has heard of gig workers and hence gig platforms. We are seeing direct sourcing emerge as one of the key channels. Even internal talent management, right, where enterprises are creating marketplaces in which they can hire internally to fill some temporary roles, is also gaining traction. And lastly, we see where they are trying to remove that middleman and go to the talent directly through digital and through digital temp agencies. So each of these alternate sourcing channels have a value proposition on their own, right? For example, internal talent marketplaces, they provide an important role because it provides enterprises an opportunity to enhance their value proposition to their employees. They allow them to bring in those innovative talent management practices where they are allowing their permanent hires to go explore a new role. They are providing learning opportunities. They are enhancing employee engagement. So each of them, as I said, bring in their own value proposition and hence can potentially act as a threat for staffing vendors. Now, if you couple this with the macro trends in the market, of course, this may become a huge threat. In isolation, each of the sourcing channels may not be a threat, but if you look at it combined, they pose enough of a challenge to the entire pie of the staffing business. Now, if you look at it from a macro perspective, where we are having recessionary winds, I mean, not to be the party pooper, everybody's talking about recession, everybody is anticipating a recession. So if you look at it from that perspective, if we consider the best case scenario and a recession doesn't happen, the pie of the market increases, staffing grows. However, these alternate sourcing channels are growing at a much faster pace than staffing firms, and hence they are taking a share of the market. Now let's look at it, from an average case scenario perspective. The pie may remain constant, because permanent hiring will slow down. enterprises will start relying on contingent. But again, some of these have a better value proposition. Maybe they're given, they're providing engagement, they're removing the middleman. Maybe enterprises are getting a better deal from these sourcing channels, and hence they may end up taking a good chunk of the pie collectively from the staffing industry. And lastly, of course, when we have the worst case scenario where recession hits and everything slows down, hiring slows down, again, they can make enough of an impact to make a huge dent in the staffing pie.
So Priyanka, any thoughts on, if and when a recession does happen, how badly will that entire talent acquisition market and staffing market get impacted? Do you see some roles getting less impacted than others?
Well, when the recession will come, or whenever it comes, of course, hiring will slow down. We have already seen some slowdown in hiring across roles, but some roles will be more resilient than others. Technology, case in point, technology is no longer a discretionary spend. Enterprises will continue to spend on technology, bringing in technology, managing technology, implementing technology, because if you don't focus on that, you have a high chance of falling behind. So those kind of roles will be more resilient than the others. And then there are, up and coming industries. Life sciences is one. You may see some slowdown in healthcare. Those kind of roles, of course, there will be a shrinkage, but they'll be more resilient.
Thanks, Priyanka. So if we move to the next slide and look at a more high-level picture, right, in terms of these issues that the staffing industry is facing, right? So one key part or key reason is the business model in itself, right? There is non-exclusive relationships with both clients and associates. Day in and day out, you're competing with your other competitors in terms of, positioning or, placing those associates, or even trying to get the associates' attention. Similarly, a lot of the success is dictated primarily by the price and speed of execution. Is the associate that you are suggesting the best price, and how quickly can you get that in? So because of both of these, we see some bit of, actually quite a bit of, lack of differentiation setting in. And if you look at the, growth statements of two major, staffing providers, you'll see that there's a lot of cyclicity in the business, right? Which is never a great position to be in. And that is where, it's important to look at this entire concept of managed services. So with that, we'll move to the first poll of the day. So the question is, what actions is your organization taking to mitigate some of these challenges? Are you pivoting towards managed services, or there are other sort of diversification in terms of skill categories, geo expansion, or adjacent businesses that you are doing? So we'll have around 30 seconds to, get the answers in.
That's interesting. Managed services and geographic expansion is winning for now.
So at least, Priyanka, that's a great validation of why we are doing the webinar. The pivot to managed services seems to be, is clearly the sort of top choice. And that is what we'll discuss in the next 45 minutes. Doesn't surprise me at all. So let's move to the next slide. So now that we have determined that managed services is the most common strategy to wade through these problems, let's quickly get into the basics in terms of what it means. So Varun?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Arko. So firstly, I would like to define what do we exactly mean by managed services. So it is an umbrella term that we are using, and the kind of products and services that it is encompassing is spread across a spectrum. On the one end of the spectrum, we have pure play output or outcome-based engagements, where the pricing is typically based on some sort of a milestone. And on the other hand of the spectrum, we have outsourcing services, such as infrastructure management, where the pricing is essentially based on time and material based. So one thing that stands common in all these type of managed services engagement is that the service provider takes partial or complete responsibility of the outcomes and the outputs. So there is some sort of a risk sharing construct that is in place between the service providers and the enterprises. That's why that's why we are saying it is a win-win for both the enterprises and the service providers. If I talk about the benefits of managed services engagement for staffing providers, the benefits are multiple. I mean, since as I've already mentioned that they are undertaking some sort of a partial or complete responsibility of the outcomes, they are essentially sharing the risk with the enterprises. So once they take on the risk, they can govern better margins and drive profitability. In a usual, traditional staff augmentation construct, there is an MSP that is involved between, staffing provider and the enterprises. So that kind of limits, the direct interaction between staffing provider and the enterprises. In a traditional staff augmentation construct, so the staffing providers can work directly with the enterprises and they can develop a long-term client relationships with them. As Orko already mentioned about the business cyclicity, so since managed services engagements are more strategic and critical in nature, so the probability of them getting impacted in a negative manner during an economic downturn is less. Hence, there becomes more visibility to the pipeline for these staffing firms, and this diversification to managed services can be seen as an effective hedge for staffing providers against the business cyclicity. Next is that but it is becoming even more important for staffing providers to offer a good experience to their associates in terms of upskilling solutions, career progression, etc. So offering their associates a mix of both traditional staff augmentation engagements and as well as managed services will give them good exposure and will definitely help them in attract and retain their talent better. Last benefit for managed services for the staffing firms include that the traditional staff augmentation market has been somewhat saturated over the last few years. The diversification to managed services space will kind of give the staffing providers new areas of growth and can unlock some additional growth opportunities.
So Varun, this definitely sounds like a good strategy for the staffing providers, but do you think enterprise buyers are thinking in the same way and they will actually look to staffing providers to manage services?
Correct, yes. Of course, that's why we are calling this entire construct as a win-win for both staffing providers and as well as the enterprises. So on the next slide, we can actually see how the adoption of these managed services constructs have fueled over the last few years. If you look at the graph on the left-hand side, the growth in the contingent workforce spend that are managed by MSP and CWM providers has grown at a highest rate, followed by independent contractors and staff augmentation. And over the last few years, the procurement spend managed by CWM providers has been growing at a very rapid rate. So to your answer, yes, definitely it's a win-win situation for both the enterprises and the staffing providers. Few of the levers for the strong enterprise demand will definitely include things like there is skill shortage that is present in the industry at this point of time, especially in the tech segment. And also we have been witnessing that a lot of skills are getting the shelf life of a lot of skills is getting shorter. So it is becoming important for these enterprises to upskill and rescale their associates frequently so that they can make them competitive in the industry. So since enterprises are not operating at a scale where they want to be, and staffing providers are highly specialized and they're operating at an even larger scale, they can offer these upskilling and reskilling solutions at a much lower cost. And a lot of enterprises are kind of relying on staffing providers to offer upskilling and reskilling services. Also, as I've already discussed, there is a risk sharing construct that is there between the staffing providers and the enterprises. That's one of the very big advantage for enterprise is that they don't have to take the end responsibility of the outcomes. It is the staffing providers who are taking the end-to-end responsibility of the outcomes. Next is that, enterprises can save a lot of time and effort in terms of, the staffing providers will try to identify certain requirements that is getting very repetitive from the enterprises, and they try and develop some sort of a plug and play solution for them, which is easy to deploy, that can save a lot of time and effort for them. And lastly, we have been seeing a lot of demand from the mid to small sized projects, from small to mid sized enterprises. And we believe that is the area where managed services players can play. We'll talk about this in detail in the next section, but I think that's where these providers can definitely play.
Thanks, Varun, for setting the stage. So let's now get into the real meat of the discussion: how to navigate this transition from staff augmentation to managed services. So Priyanka, probably let's start with the basics in terms of what exactly are the points of difference between the two talent models.
And you're right, Orko, you use the right word, that there are some fundamental and basic differences in the operating model, right? In terms of how different providers play in this market, or rather in terms of the differences between a managed services providers and a staffing firm. If you look at it from a vendor selection perspective, let's start at the beginning, right? When you enter into an engagement, when you try to enter into an engagement, if you look at vendor selection, in staff augmentation, typically there is an MSP involved, who is responsible for curating the supplier pool. So already there is a barrier to it, compared to an RFP-based approach, where an enterprise may send an RFP and all managed services can participate, and hence have, if they provide a good solution, they have the opportunity to go. Then let's look at, what they provide. In the end, both of them are providing talent, right? But the way they provide talent differs. And what I mean is that, even in sourcing and selection, there is a difference. So in a managed services construct, the service provider curates a list of talent after they have won the engagement, so that they know who's the best fit in terms of being able to serve that engagement. While in a staff org kind of a scenario, there is an MSP who is maybe responsible for hiring. And in a staff org, you also have this early bird gets the worm, right? As you said, it's about speed. It's about making sure that you're providing the best fit at the right time and at the right speed. Then let's look at the execution part. Who is responsible for what in a managed services versus staff org kind of a relationship. In a managed services construct, as Varun mentioned, the provider has to take end-to-end responsibility of delivering. They are responsible for course correction. They are responsible for providing the right quality. In a staff org, typically the MSP takes care of the admin part. An enterprise kind of, the procurement team from the enterprise may be responsible for quality tracking and, again, required course correction. And lastly, when it comes to billing, both time and materials, but again, the quantum of responsibility differs. So in staff org, time and material with maybe no relation or very little relation to the outcome, while on the managed services side, there is a risk sharing, as Varun was talking about, that there is a significant responsibility in terms of outputs and SLAs. So net, what I'm trying to drive is that there are fundamental things that are different in a staff org engagement as compared to a managed services engagement. And this requires a very deep rethink when a staff org player wants to enter the space.
So Priyanka, based on what you were saying, seems like the staffing provider, when they're doing that rethink, it's actually a pretty big change in the business model itself, right? So yes. I think we are already here, but what do you think a staffing provider should do to make this a successful pivot?
Absolutely. As staffing providers strategize to expand into the managed services space or pivot completely, it requires a certain different thinking, right? As I said, a shift in the mindset. What we have tried to do here is articulate some of them in terms of what kind of stakeholder changes the staffing provider has to invest in, what kind of talent attraction as well as management investments that they have to make they'll have to, if they want to compete head to head with managed services providers, they have to be very targeted. I mean, the best approach is to be targeted. Of course, you can have different strategies. The best approach is to be targeted and hence develop those targeted solutions that will help you win against those marquee providers already in the market. And lastly, you also need to, as you look to develop these solutions, you also have to look internally in terms of, do I need to hire different kind of talent, right? Do I need to change the way I do my sales? Do I need to position myself differently in the market, as I'm looking to sell different kind of services? Those are different things that they'll have to rethink. And I believe Varun will be, starting off with the first few investment areas.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Priyanka. So yeah, this slide talks about the first key consideration for the staffing firms that they have to think of in terms of key stakeholder experience. So contingent staffing has long been seen as a procurement problem, but gradually the things are evolving and changing as the contingent workforce is essentially becoming more strategic for the enterprises. Now, all these stakeholders that you see on the slides, they have multiple interaction points in the value chain. So it becomes very important for the staffing firm to have some sort of a visibility across the value chain in order to deliver some sort of a superior experience to all the stakeholders. And they can do so by ensuring that they have necessary processes and technologies in place for each of the stakeholders. Let's consider an example of MSP. It is getting important for staffing firms to maintain good relationships with MSP, especially in the managed services construct, as the scope of MSP is increasing gradually from a P2P to, let's say, S2C space. If I talk about candidate and workers, as we have already discussed, that the lines between permanent and the contingent talent are blurring. Thus, it is becoming important for staffing firms to give their associates an experience which is very similar to the permanent talent. It can be achieved, through multiple methods. A few of the methods could be, offering them better compensation or offering them, better upskilling opportunities. We'll discuss that in detail on the next slide. Also, staffing firms can ensure that they could have some sort of a tools and technology in place so that they can deliver better associate experience. The tools and technologies that they can deploy can include something like a candidate attraction and engagement platforms to better engage and attract with their associates. If I talk about hiring managers usually require some sort of a market insights, data analytics, or AI to ensure that the talent that they're hiring is coming with the right set of skills. So there is a need for staffing firms to ensure that the hiring managers are equipped with such tools, and they can be equipped with some additional tools, just the like of tools that could help them easily draft a SOW engagement. If I talk about procurement and the HR leaders, so services procurement spend is typically has mostly been ad hoc in nature. Thus, it becomes very important for staffing firms to have some sort of a dashboard in place where the procurement and HR leaders have the entire visibility of the entire spend that has been happening. So overall, in a nutshell, since all these stakeholders are interacting with each other at multiple points, it becomes very important for the staffing firm to deliver superior experience across all the stakeholders.
So Varun, in the managed services construct, do you think staffing providers need to build deeper relationships with business leaders than in the staff augmentation model?
Correct. Yes. As I said, business leaders also play a very significant role. And that's why, you'll see a lot of events such as supplier days or meetings with business leaders, with hiring managers is becoming even more important at this point of time. If there is an MSP involved, then they can help to, help to get those conversations set up, or an in-house procurement function will need to enable that. But yes, it is very important for them to have those connects. Okay, so next slide, we are talking essentially about the the comprehensive associate talent management strategy. And it is very important for the staffing providers to have it in place because it will help them to attract and retain associates. So a comprehensive talent management strategy can be broken down into two areas. First one are the monetary incentives, and first component of monetary incentive could be the hourly wages. So we have seen that over the last few months there has been an acute shortage of skills in the industry, especially in the IT side. So right now, a lot of skilled workers are governing, very high wage rates. So staffing firms need to ensure that, the wages that are being paid to the contingent workforce is at par with their expectations. Next component in the monetary incentives are the bonuses. So bonuses is something which wasn't a part of the compensation of contingent workforce. But since the lines between permanent and the contingent talent is blurring, so contingent labor is expecting some sort of a bonus as well to become a part of their compensation. These bonuses could be something like joining bonus or a milestone based bonus or a completion bonus or something like a referral bonus as well. And also contingent labor is also expecting some sort of other incentives as well. These could be in the form of having their paid time off to be equivalent to their counterparts in permanent employees, or a lot of permanent employees get discounts and special discounts on third party partners on products and services. Contingent labor is also having a similar expectations to get those discounts. These could be something like discounts on gym membership, discounts on some sort of electronic gadgets like fitness bands and etc. On the next front, we have a lot of non-monetary and talent development incentives. So the upskilling and reskilling component is something which we have discussed a lot in detail. That how the contingent labor is expecting robust upskilling and reskilling opportunities from the staffing providers so that they can remain competitive in the market. If we see this contingent talent model as an overall, we will kind of see this model evolving into something like an agency model, wherein we kind of believe that there will be a talent management firm which would be managing a particular talent end to end. And in this case, I mean, if I draw a parallel or if I draw an analogy, it will be somewhat similar to like we have in sports industries and in the entertainment industry. So typically, these agencies, talent management agencies, will have a long-term relationship with the candidates or with their associates, and they will ensure that they have a next assignment in place once they are done with the current engagement. So that is something which staffing providers is also directing towards. They are planning to have a broad client portfolio that will kind of ensure that they have a next engagement ready for their associates once he or she is done with their current engagement. And also they would want to give their associates a holistic experience in terms of exploring other areas in different skills, and also giving them bigger and larger roles on different projects, because the innate expectation of the associates is to have some sort of a tangible career progression outcomes as well throughout his career when he or she is employed through a staffing firms. So they need to also keep that in mind. Lastly, we have seen a lot of demand for remote working that is coming from the contingent staffing space. The contingent workforce also expect benefits which are paid similar to the permanent employees in terms of having flexibility in terms of working. Maybe it can be in the form of work from anywhere, work from home, or or things like that. So delivering this holistic or this comprehensive talent management strategy is very important for staffing firms, if they want to attract and retain employees.
Yeah, Varun, very interesting points, especially the career progression caught my eye, because traditionally when I just think of it, it sounds like something for permanent employees. But I guess based on what you are saying is the staffing provider needs to ensure that the next opportunity is in place, and the next opportunity for the associate is a better opportunity, maybe more complex opportunity, better paying opportunity, and probably even with better brands, right? So
Right.
that is how the career progression moving forward. Great. So back to you on solutions and key clients.
Yeah. So I mean, as we have already discussed that shifting to managed services construct is very necessary for staffing firms to drive things like margins and growth. but it is equally important for them to identify right set of clients and industry where they have a high probability of winning. So staffing firms typically don't have a permission to play everywhere in the managed services construct. What we have observed is that most of the large scale clients prefer to work with established managed services firms. This can be because of few reasons. These reasons could be, these large enterprises will have resources and the budget to hire a large managed services provider, and they also have less propensity to take risk. Moreover, if I look at, on the other hand, the large managed services companies, they also tend to work with large scale clients that as they are operating on high operating leverages, and it is making very little sense for them to engage in mid to small scale enterprises. Hence, we believe that a small to mid scale requirements for a small to mid size enterprise is potentially the white space for the staffing providers to address. And if I talk about certain nuances in this space, within this market, if I talk about especially IT, we have seen that COVID pandemic has accelerated a lot of cloud adoption for small and mid-size enterprises. And we see that with increased migration to cloud, there is also an increased demand for cybersecurity solutions. Also on the financial services side, we are seeing that there is a lot of demand for analytics in the financial services industry, which is essentially very fragmented. And there are several small to mid-sized financial institutions in let's say US who are operating on legacy systems. So these financial institutions are kind of undergoing a transformation, and during that transformation they would be leveraging data analytics, AI, and cloud capabilities to achieve better efficiencies. So that can also be a good spot for the staffing providers to play. And we are also seeing a lot of staffing firms establishing center of excellence for quality assurance and testing services over the past few years. Talking about the businesses, finance and accounting and HR functions, for the larger enterprises, it's a strategic function, and they tend to outsource it to a large, IT services company. But for a small to mid-sized companies, finance, accounting, and HR function is not that strategic, and they can outsource it to a managed service provider. And we have also seen a lot of staffing firms developing capabilities for contract center outsourcing in the recent years. If I talk about some of the industry level, applications, so we have seen, let's say in healthcare and life sciences, we have seen pharmacovigilance and regulatory and medical affairs as a key area where a lot of managed service providers are playing. So once through all these steps, the staffing firms identifies the clients and industry that they want to operate in. They need to develop some sort of a plug and play solution to serve their needs. So for the same, they need to make some strategic investments around some repurposable assets, things like accelerator, tools, and methodologies. And once they have those repurposable assets in place, they need to develop some sort of a turnkey solution, and they need to focus on how they can optimize that solution based on the feedback that they're getting, and expand their capabilities to new geographies and new industries. As I said, they can do so by leveraging the lessons that they have learned and the capabilities that they have developed in the process of exploring that solution, and expand it to newer geographies and the new adjacent industries.
Yeah, thanks, Varun. In fact, I would say that even on the larger enterprises, especially when they're looking to diversify their supplier portfolio, staffing providers can have a good opportunity. But net, it's a big go-to-market decision for all the staffing providers, especially in terms of the careful analysis of the market attractiveness of various segments in terms of the size, past, and future growth. So let's have one level of testing here in the webinar itself. So poll for you, in which of these areas does your organization seeing the most traction for managed services? So we'll have 30 seconds to get the answers. I think as the answers flowing in, really no surprises. Cloud and cybersecurity, IT managed services are top. The top of the chart, I think a lot of other IT managed services areas as well. And then I think on the non-IT side, very understandably, contact center is one of the top ones. So that pretty much matches with our own hypothesis. But for individual staffing firms, it's still a big strategy and a decision to take, especially understanding the competition in each of these areas, right? Essentially the permission to play beyond the big IT outsourcing or IT managed service providers or the big BPO providers, right? With that, I'll hand over to Priyanka for some of the other key considerations for staffing providers.
Sure. So, then we also have to consider, as staffing vendors look to pivot towards managed services, there are other areas in which they have to develop capabilities. One of them is around staffing model, because as I said earlier in the slide, in terms of how they play, managed service providers may have a permanent talent bench. Staffing firms, they don't. So how would you go about creating that talent pool so that you have permission to play, and so that you can go ahead in the market and say that, yes, I have a pool of talent. And that is where choosing the right industry, choosing the right skill kind of comes into play. For example, if you're competing in the IT market, there is an unsaid expectation that you'll have a permanent bench, right? Because everybody has that. However, if you're playing in the F&A or the contact center piece, traditionally BPS or business process service providers who provide these services do not have a talent bench, right? They create their teams after they have a deal in hand. So what kind of staffing model do you want to build? And how do you make sure that it balances your utilization with cost is a key question to answer. And lastly, we also have some internal talent management practices that you need to bring in, or rather you have to build internal talent as well as you pivot, or as staffing vendors pivot towards managed services. Just let's look at what Varun spoke about in terms of providing comprehensive solutions to talent. So no longer will just being a recruiter be enough. You have to become like a talent advocate, if I may use that word, or somebody like as Varun used in the sports connotation, you're becoming an agent, right? Where you are not only responsible for hiring them, but also their career progression. So how would you develop those career progression? The staffing vendors have to develop career progression frameworks, performance management frameworks for bonuses. They have to bring in people management capabilities in order to handle that talent, which earlier they didn't have. They have to bring in technology solutions to provide learning, upskilling solutions to be able to retain the associate that they have hired. And on the flip side, on the sales side, you have to have people that speak the language, speak the managed services language, right? So how do you make sure that you attract that talent? How do you change your compensation structure? How do you change your incentive structure from a sales perspective to bring in? How do you bring in, another question is around how, once you've brought these salespeople in, how do you make sure that they're selling it to the right people? How do you make sure that you have the right leaders in place so that your salespeople are actually going out and selling it to the right people? So if you look at the next big question that we have, and I think this is something that everybody is grappling with, is positioning. Where do you position and market? So when you're looking at branding, given there are big staffing vendors who have established names in the staffing space, in the contingent space, in the overall talent space, as they look to pivot, there are a couple of questions that they'll be grappling with, a couple of questions where they should spend enough time to think about. So the first one is, should staffing vendors build a new brand for managed services, or they continue with their own brand, with their existing brand, and how will that work out? The second one is, even if you build solutioning in the space, right? As Varun mentioned, that you need to have solutioning in order to stand toe to toe with managed services. How do you make sure that you cover the distance about the perceived differences between a staffing vendor and a managed services firm. And lastly, uh, there will be points of contention where you may have managed services providers as your clients. So how do you make sure that you manage that conflict of interest? How do you make sure that you manage client expectations? How do you ensure that you continue to retain those clients while also operating in the same business as they are? And also, how do you make sure that you manage your staff aug business, because that is not going anywhere, right? That's your established business, and managed services is an up and coming business. How do you manage the balance between those two businesses? Is the balance required? So these are all hard questions that staffing firms have to grapple with and are grappling with. And we hope to give you enough examples in the next couple of slides so that you can also ponder upon those.
So Priyanka, before we get into the answers, are there any examples of where a staffing company has made this transition successfully and has the brand visibility now of the IT outsourcing or IT managed service provider?
That's a great question, Orko. Actually, we have many companies who have made that pivot. And the pivot has happened a couple of years back, or I would say a decade back. If you consider Indian heritage players, they started off traditionally as staff of players in the IT services space and the BPA space. And they have realized, maybe because they saw better margins or maybe they saw that they can differentiate, they realized and made that pivot very soon. And today they are the top providers or top companies in the world providing managed services. Of course, the market conditions today have changed. So there are new challenges that staffing firms have to face. But we have examples of those providers who have made the pivot in the past. And I call them early movers, as you will see in the next couple of slides. So if we look to answer the questions from the previous slide, right? If we just move to the previous slide, I posed a lot of questions. So one way to look at it, whether you want to leverage an existing brand or come up with a new brand, is to think from a view of what problems or what challenges would you be facing, right, for each scenario. So for example, if it's a large provider with established pedigree in the market, right, somebody who has that name power and they have, a known presence in the market, they may consider going with that same brand and saying that, hey, we have been doing this very well and we are just doing this now and we are doing it and we can do it much better. And on the other hand, we have seen, mid-tier clients or mid-tier firms who maybe are still playing in the space, they have good capabilities, but they have not necessarily made a name in the market. We have seen them go and establish a new brand, right? But net, what they have done is, what everybody has to do is, make sure that there is enough differentiation between the staff augmentation offering and the managed services offering. And that happens when you have a completely separate, either a business unit or a separate brand. Because as Varun and I articulated, there are some fundamental differences in the way these markets operate, right? And there are also some conflicts of interest. So in order to manage that, it's important that you have a separate view, which will have specialized team with dedicated leadership, with the right expertise, and build the right sales team in order to make sure that you're speaking the language, you're positioning the right offering in front of the right client. Also, from an organizational structure and incentive structure, you have the right incentive structure for your sales teams and the right organizational structure so that you can continue to build your associate program, continue to bring all those talent management capabilities that you need to have, all those project management capabilities that you need to have in order to succeed in managed services. And lastly, of course, invest in repurposable assets, as Varun mentioned. These could be accelerators, it could be augmentation technologies and solutions that just position you better in terms of in front of the client. Now let's look at the next slide is all about examples. As I said, we have three kinds of providers in this space who have made this pivot or are in the process of making this pivot into managed services. We have early movers, Indian heritage providers who started off as staff aug vendors. Some of them still do staff augmentation along with the managed services, but they have repositioned themselves very strongly in the managed services space. They have made significant branding and marketing efforts to make sure that that position is very strong. Now, if you look at the current market, we have two types of players, right? Larger players who are still trying to pivot into the space, and even there we see a mixed bag. There is no silver bullet in terms of how you can get capabilities, how you can get these capabilities. You can go the organic route, you can go the inorganic route. As you can see, we have seen a lot many acquisitions in the past year just to gain these capabilities. Even in the majority player bucket, depending upon where they are in that marketing, in the strength of their brand, we have seen companies come out with a specialist brand just for the managed services. And we have also seen companies just take out a chunk of the business, create a new business unit, and which focuses just on managed services. And the late movers, providers or firms which have still not made a strong move, they play very opportunistically. They are being very cautious, but even they are investing and developing and identifying niche areas in which they can play to their strengths, and hence again build that pipeline of managed services clients. Again, while building, repurposable assets, making sure that they have the right talent to manage people, the right sales to sell, and the right kind of incentives to attract talent.
So thank you, Priyanka, and thanks, Varun, for the very insightful comments. So we'll get into the Q&A section for the day. So of course, we have few questions from today, but we also have sent out a sort of survey earlier, and there are questions from earlier. So before we get into the questions, we have a complimentary offer for you in terms of the webinar participants. So there are two reports which are very closely linked to what we discussed today. So please indicate in the survey whether you want to get access to these sort of reports. So coming to the questions. So I think we had a series of questions very similar, which was, what are the top drivers companies are seeing to use managed services model versus the staffing model, or rather, what is the advantage of managed services model over the time and material? And as related to that was, do you think in the future companies will still utilize staffing or managed services, or will it be both?
So Argo, I can take that answer. So shifting to managed services is actually a win-win for both the staffing providers and the enterprises. So the drivers would be different for staffing providers and enterprises. For staffing providers, as we've already discussed, the drivers could be better margins or long-term relationships with their enterprises. They can get access to new business opportunities and more predictability when it comes to their businesses, and less impact on business cyclicity. For enterprises, the drivers could be things like they're getting easy access to talent and at a little cheaper price, even for the talents that are in demand. And since the risk is essentially being shared by the staffing providers as well, so there is less risk for enterprises. And the drivers vary for both the staffing providers and the enterprises, but this entire construct is going to be a win-win for both of them. To your question on if there is one model that will exist in the future, or will both the models coexist, a short answer would be yes, both the models will coexist in the future. So depending upon the criticality of the engagement or frequency of the engagement, the enterprises can choose to either outsource it to a managed service provider, or have an output based engagement, or maybe can deploy staff augmentation. But our assessment says that all these models will tend to coexist in the future.
Thanks, Varun. And probably the last question for the day. So Priyanka, for you, is there any differentiation in the staffing provider landscape with respect to managed services? And I'm seeing you start smiling. And the comment was, all providers seem fairly similar.
Wow, very good question. If you look at in terms of just offerings, you may be right that there is not much differentiation. At the end of the day, you're providing talent. But if you dig a little deeper, there is a lot of difference in terms of what one staffing provider is doing versus the other. We spoke in terms of skills, right? Just let's look at it from a couple of lenses. So let's look at it from let's look at from skills, right? So there are certain providers who operate and provide the right skills. So you will have specialist IT providers, you will have specialist engineering services providers, specialist healthcare providers, and they are specialists because they know how to attract that talent, how to get access to that talent, they know how to build those talent pools, and they know how to message to that talent, right? So from a skill perspective, you will find a differentiation. Now, in terms of, and secondly, if you think about from a capability perspective, from a staffing provider lens, you would want, from an enterprise perspective, you would want to get access to the right talent at the right price point. And staffing providers can do that when they have the right technology. When they inject the right technology, they can bring the talent at the right price point. So having technology and the ability to inject technology where it is relevant kind of brings a differentiation again. Now let's look at what we spoke today from a managed services perspective. Of course, not every staffing vendor is doing it. And that's because many staffing vendors are at different parts or different points in their journey. Many providers have, I wouldn't say cracked the code, but are much ahead in terms of the managed services offering, and hence have developed certain services or certain offerings which also flow into your staff augmentation and makes them better. Some providers are going there and are still building it. So building technology, building candidate experience, building hiring manager experience, procurement experience, and are able to roll that over to the staff. So if you look at it from a very high level, yes, everybody is providing talent, but there is actually a lot of differentiation to be found in the market, right? In terms of sophistication of solution, sophistication in terms of how they manage, how they engage with their clients, even with an MSP present.
Thanks.
Sophistication in terms of the skills that we provide.
Yep, thank you, Priyanka. And that is where we have an entire library of reports which can help you answer a lot of these questions across the entire contingent space and specifically on the staffing area. So that's all from us today. Thank you very much for listening to us and connecting with us. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you.